Dr. Clare Walker is the Manager of Public Programs and Master Naturalist at Irvine Nature Center in Owings Mills, Maryland. There she installs and maintains wildlife-friendly native plant gardens and shares her expertise with visitors. Welcome, Clare.
Welcome. Thank you. So I'm excited today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is definitely bumblebees. So I really like bees of all kinds, but bumblebees have to be everybody's favorite ones. So as I said, today we're going to be looking at the wonderful lives of bumblebees and how we can help them, because they are definitely a bee that's having some troubles. So today in this hour, we're going to talk about what makes a bumblebee, why they are so cute, the evolution of them, so why they have these special adaptations, a bit about their life cycle, because they really do have a very unique life cycle, quite different from most other bees. The bumblebees that you could see in Maryland. Now, I know a lot of you might be joining us from outside of the Maryland, Washington, D.C. area, but these are what they're going to be the bees that are most common up and down the East Coast. Then I'm going to look briefly at like the threats that our bumblebees unfortunately are under, and wrap up with how you can help these bumblebees. And because one of the wonderful things about things like bees is that really we can do the helping. If I was giving you a program that was about polar bears or something, it feels like, what can I do to help? But bumblebees are something that every one of us can do something to help them out. So whenever I mention the word bees, what I actually find is jumping into everybody's heads are pictures of honey and like those bee boxes that have beekeepers in the veils looking after them. Or for kids, they usually know that bees do waggle dances. And really, everybody is thinking about this guy, the European honeybee. But if I asked you to draw a bee, most people would draw something that looks like this, because that's a bumblebee. And bumblebees are what mentally we think about, because we think about those black and yellow stripes, because they are the cute bee. So what's the difference between European honeybees that so many people are thinking about and bumblebees? Well, there is one really big area of overlap between these two different bees, and that is that both of them have a special part on their hind legs called a corbicula, or a pollen basket. And this is like a flat, slightly concave area on their legs surrounded by long hairs that allows them to carry a mixture of pollen and nectar back to the hive. So most bees actually collect their pollen dry, but bumblebees and honeybees will collect pollen off of flowers and mix it up with nectar. You can see them kind of grooming themselves and using their tongue a lot, and it makes a wet mix that's kind of Play-Doh-like in its consistency, that they can just slap on their back legs and haul that big load back to the hive. But really, that's the place where honeybees and bumblebees start to divide, because both of these bees do have hives, but honeybees are in mostly like the man-made hives, the big boxes, and there might be up to 60,000 bees in a single hive, whereas bumblebees, the very largest bumblebee hive might have a few hundred bees, but it's actually much more normal to just have about 50 bees in a bumblebee hive. Also, those European honeybees hives are perennial. They last year after year, and the queen in there might last for be several years old. But a bumblebee hive is actually just an annual thing. It grows through the summer, and then it's all going to end at the end of that year. So it's just an annual cycle. And that's because the bumblebees don't collect honey, so they can't stay awake in the wintertime. And actually, only the queen bees, as we're going to learn, survive the winter, and they have to hibernate. So they go and find a place to hibernate. Now, whenever I talk about bees, one of the things that everyone's always worried about is stings. And it's true that any female bee, because male bees don't have stingers, have the potential to sting. However, unlike the honeybees, the bumblebees don't like the stingers aren't barbed, so they don't stay in your skin, sorry, and they don't rip out of the bee. And so a bumblebee won't die when it stings like a honeybee does. And then the interesting thing is, like, apart from some very rare exceptions that I'm going to talk about later, and we're not actually allergic to bumblebee or any of our native bees' stings. So if you know someone that has bee allergies, and they can be very serious, those allergies only come into play if they get stung by a honeybee, not by bumblebees. And that's because they have these teeny tiny hives and they don't have to worry about driving away large mammals like humans and bears that might want to steal their honey. So, as I said, they don't have honey, the last point of it. But bumblebees do actually, the queen, make a little tiny honey pot, and we'll see one of those later. And of course, for me, the really big issue is our bumblebees are native, whereas you've heard me say several times, European honeybees. They were brought over here by people kind of like me coming over from Europe who wanted the benefits of all that honey and, of course, the wax that used to be so important for making candles. Well, the truth of the matter is that there's a huge number of our wild plants that are totally dependent on bumblebees for their pollination. And if we lose bumblebees, we risk losing a huge chunk of the diversity of our wildflowers that are outside. So, bumblebees, we might have already kind of said, they're kind of the cute bee. For me, they're kind of like the teddy bear of the bee world, because they're fat and chunky and really fuzzy. And this all relates to their evolution. So bumblebees are actually a latecomer in the bee world. They probably evolved only about 30 million years ago. And we think they evolved in the Himalayas region because that's where our greatest bumblebee diversity is. And they evolved in this cold area of the world, the Himalayas, during a cold period. And so they actually evolved a whole load of adaptations that allowed them to survive cold conditions. And they're not very well suited to warm areas. And so bumblebees actually have stayed in the northern hemisphere. And the only place you can find them in the southern hemisphere is in South America, because they were able to travel along the heights of the Andes to stay in cool conditions to get down to South America. So part of this adaptation that they have is that they are kind of the chunky end of the bee world. They are definitely very round and robust bees, and that helps with like heat preservation. And then they have really thick, fuzzy fur coats. So, that's the other thing that makes them so attractive. But they have a very special adaptation that allows them to fly in cool weather. So if you think about insects, we usually think of them about being about being cold-bodied creatures, so that they don't generate their own heat. But in fact, bumblebees are not like that. They have the ability to generate heat. There's a really great video that I highly recommend. You can see it online, done by one of my personal heroes, David Attenborough, in the Life in the Undergrowth series, about how bumblebees raise their temperature. And basically, in order to fly around, they need their internal temperature to be about 86 Fahrenheit. But in early spring, the weather might only be in the 30s. And so to raise their internal temperature, what bumblebees are able to do is they actually unhook their wings from their flight muscles. And then they basically contract their flight muscles or shiver. And by doing that, they're able to raise the temperature of their body. And you can see this is a heat camera showing how this queen bumblebee is raising her temperature. So this adaptation to the cold has actually had huge impacts for how bumblebees are able to pollinate. And one of the reasons we're also very interested in this bee. So because of this ability to shiver or shake themselves really hard, bumblebees are one of the few bees that can carry out a special type of pollination called buzz pollination. And many of our flowers have actually adapted so that only bumblebees can be efficient pollinators of them. And you might recognize, if you're a gardener, this flower over here, which is a tomato flower. And if you've ever looked closely at a tomato, unlike many flowers, you can't see the stamen or the stigma of this flower. And that's because the stamen have fused into this tube. And in order to get the pollen out of that, we have to do something special. So I'm hoping my little video here is going to start. And we weren't able to make the sound work, so I'm going to talk you through it. But this is a slow motion video produced by the Smithsonian, and really worth looking online. But you can see that the bee is like grabbing onto that anther tube, and then she's unhooking her wings. And so then is going to shake as hard as they can onto that flower. And so just like shaking a salt pot or pepper pot, the pollen then actually dislodges from inside that tube onto the bee itself. And you can see the bees positioning themselves so all the pollen just lands onto the bee. And then they'll actually groom all that pollen to put it into their pollen baskets so they can carry the whole load of it back to their colony. So it allows a really, really efficient method to collect pollen so that bumblebees will hunt out these types of flowers. So the whole Solanaceae family, which tomatoes are in, have that type of flower. And that includes things like peppers and eggplants. So if you grow these plants in your garden, you really want to have bumblebees because they are so much more efficient at pollinating those flowers that you will get much higher yields, anywhere from 25% to 50% higher yields of these plants. So it used to be until the 1990s, if you're old enough, you might remember that it was very rare to get tomatoes out of season, in the winter time. But then all of a sudden, tomatoes started to become available out of season. And the reason was, but at that time, some Dutch scientists figured out how to raise bumblebees inside of artificial hives that they could then take into greenhouses and use the bees to do the pollination of tomatoes in greenhouses. Before that, they had to have people doing it by hand with like little brushes. So it was really expensive to grow, out of season tomatoes. So it's caused this huge explosion, and is like all due to the fact that we're able to, bring in bumblebees. But it also has had some negative consequences, which I'm going to have to talk about later. So this isn't the only thing that makes bumblebees a great pollinator, though. They also can have really long tongues. We'll look at some of these flowers later, but some flowers are adapted so they can only be pollinated by bumblebees because they're the only ones whose tongue is long enough to reach all the way into the flower. They're also really strong bees. We've talked about how robust they are. So many flowers are in the pea family. You might recognize this flower here as part of the pea group. It's actually a plant that'll be flowering anytime now with how warm it is this week, called wild blue indigo. This flower actually also hides its stamen and stigma, so those vital parts for pollination inside these side petals that are called the wings of the pea flower. And in order to do the pollinating, you kind of have to get these two bits and pry them apart in order to reach inside of the flower. So the bumblebee is actually strong enough to use its back legs to open and spread those two petals apart. And as they do that, the stigma and stamen actually kind of like are on a spring action, and they'll like raise up and hit the bumblebee, as you can see here, right on their abdomen. So there's like tons of hair there for all the pollen to get stuck onto the bee's body, and then for them to transport it onto the next flower when they do the same thing. So yeah, there's a whole load of these pea family plants that are the bumblebees are really important pollinators for too. Okay, so I just wanted to discuss the really interesting life cycle that a bumblebee goes through. So right now, if you go outside, for about the last month or so, we've been seeing emerging the first of this year's bumblebees. And these are queens coming out from their overwinter hibernation. So for most bumblebees, that's been a hole in the ground. And so they're going to come out, and then the queen is going to get really busy collecting food and finding a place to raise her young. So she will raise her first brood of daughters, and then she stays in the nest, and the daughters start going out to collect food, and the colony starts to grow until later on in the summer, the queen lays male and female eggs that will be turned into, become the drones and next year's queens. And those queens, after mating, will hibernate, and they will be next year's queens, like to make their own hives. So we're just going to look at that in just a bit more detail. So like I said, the queens have been emerging. Usually about mid-March is when I expect them to come out. But with our extremely warm spring this year, they were probably a little ahead of normal schedule. And the first thing, obviously, you've been sleeping all winter. They're really hungry. So these queens come out, and the first priority is to feed, feed, feed. And one of the plants that is really available for them at this time of year is early spring blossom. So they visit a lot of red maples, and in this case, willows that are some of the earlier flowering plants with lots of pollen. They also like to visit some of our, most beautiful spring ephemerals. If you haven't had the chance at the moment, we're a full spring ephemeral time of year. So taking a walk in woodlands at the moment could just be a joy, seeing things like the Virginia bluebells over here, or even Dutchman's breeches. And this plant, Dutchman's breeches, this bee is like on the back of it and would not cooperate and come around to demonstrate how she will actually pollinate from this flower. But to actually get to the nectar, she has to hang at the entrance of the flower, which is down at the bottom of the trousers, I guess. But the nectar that she wants to get to is at the very tip of these breeches, the trousers. So she needs a tongue that's long enough to reach all the way up to the tip of this flower. And so only queen bumblebees that would be out at this time of year are able to do that and pollinate Dutchman's breeches. So these flowers really are dependent on having bumblebees around. Some other bees are able to access the nectar, and they are nectar robbers. They will come up the top here and actually just chew open the top of a Dutchman's breeches, and so access nectar that way. But the queens will still go in from the bottom, and they will just get there and find there's less nectar than they're meant to be. And it was kind of interesting because in a study that was done, it was found that this didn't hurt the flowers at all, having nectar robbers, because it just meant the bumblebees had to go to more flowers to collect the same amount of nectar. So the actual flowers were more likely to be pollinated when there were not nectar robbers around at all. But tough for the queen bumblebee, who's got more work to do. So having collected lots of food, her next priority is to find a place to nest. So I often see bumblebees in the early spring crawling through what just looks like the leaf litter and looking under leaves, like I found this bumblebee doing. And she's trying to find a perfect place for her nest. And what they're looking for is somewhere that's insulated. So often they will go into old kind of like mouse holes or chipmunk holes where there's like nesting material inside. So they're just going to crawl down the entrance and go into that nest, or they sometimes just go into the bottom of like really thick clumps of grasses where they're going to get lots of insulation. And occasionally they will use human-made structures as well. So having found that perfect home, and it's not easy, there's a lot of competition to find these perfectly well insulated nests, as you can see here, she's going to make a big pile of pollen that will be the food for her first daughters. But you might know at this time of year, we could have a day like today where it's 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and then a day like tomorrow might be when it might be wet and cold and a little bit windy. And it won't be ideal for collecting pollen, nectar at all. So to ensure herself that she's got this constant supply of food, the queen bumblebee makes a little nectar pot. So you can see this is just a teeny tiny pot that might contain 1 or 2 teaspoons of nectar that she fills, and that's just her personal supply to keep her well fed while she's insulating the eggs. So in order to make the eggs, progress faster, bumblebees actually have a little brood patch on their tummies, just like you might have heard that birds have female birds will have a bare patch on their tummy so that she can sit on those eggs, and if the temperature gets too low, she does the shake, so uncouples those the wings from her flight muscles, and will raise her temperature to keep those eggs nice and warm so that they will hatch. Then the queen has done her hard work. From that point on, the daughters go out and do all the work. She sits in the nest and never leaves it again because she's just going to be laying eggs. So usually a queen will struggle to raise her first set of 5 or 6 daughters all on her own. And often those first daughters don't get as much food and they can be smaller, the first workers. And then usually as the colony starts to grow, the size of the workers, because they're getting more food, also starts to grow. But also just some of the workers who might be at the side of the big pile of pollen don't get as much food, and they will be smaller. So there's always a variation in size of these workers, and it tends to be that the bigger ones go off and do the foraging for pollen and nectar, and the smaller bees kind of stay home and look after their siblings. So there's a bit of a division of labor, but all the workers are full females, as it were. They're able to lay eggs and everything. So it's not the same as quite as the worker caste that are with European honeybees. Then once the hive has got to its full size, whether that's 50 bees or maybe 200 bees, the queen will decide when it's time to lay male eggs. So the only difference between a male egg and a female egg is that male eggs are actually unfertilized. So any of the daughters, workers, are also able to lay male eggs. And then she's going to also lay female eggs, and having laid male eggs, that triggers the workers to feed those new female eggs when they hatch more food. And that's the only difference that makes them grow into queens, is that they'll be fed more. But because the males are unfertilized, one of the weird things about bees that always makes me kind of laugh is that male bees, it's because they come from an unfertilized egg, they actually have no father, and will have no sons. So they have grandfathers and grandsons. It's just the way bee genetics works. When the new queens come out, she's going to be starting to get ready to hibernate. So she's really focuses on just eating, trying to get big and fat like a bear that's about to go into hibernation. But this time of year, because all the daughters can lay eggs if they want of males, you get to see lots and lots of male bees around, and you can usually tell those ones because they actually have slightly hairy back legs. They don't have that corbicular, the kind of shiny area that a female bumblebee will have. They also tend to have longer, shaggier, bed-ready hair, and often beards or mustaches on their face of blonde hair. So hairy legs, long hair, and beards kind of make a male bee. The female bee, new female queens, will be hunting for a safe place to spend the winter, and that has its own special name, a hibernacula. So, but when that has happened, once those males and the new queens have left the hive, then the old hive just dies, so that it's the end of that year's hive. So one of the things you might have noticed from going through that yearly cycle is that bumblebees are going to be looking for flowers all the way from spring, like the red buds that are flowering right now, all the way till fall when they're fattening up for the winter, when our asters and stuff are flowering. So that makes bumblebees very much flower generalists. They have to go to all different kinds of flowers. And to be a flower generalist, you actually have to be really smart. Flowers that go to one type of bees that go to one type of flower, sorry, can be kind of like you're just a one-trick pony. You only have to learn one thing, and so those bees don't have to be as smart. But bumblebees have to be super smart, and one of the things I really like is some researchers in the UK decided to test how smart bees were. And of course, they tested them by getting them to play soccer. So they taught them that if they pushed a ball into the goal at the center of their plate, then they would get a nectar reward. So this bee's going to go in and get a bit of sugar. And so bees are very motivated to get sugar water. So after training, they really quickly learn it. All I have to do is roll the ball into the goal, and then I'm going to get some more sugar water. So bees are able to learn this process from each other. So because bumblebees will watch each other to see how to exploit flower resources, and they're able to make smart decisions. So this bee flies in, checks out the positions, and picks the ball that's closest to the center so that they can do the least amount of work to get their reward. One of the things during this process that the researchers noticed was that sometimes it looked like the bees were just playing with the balls when there was no reward being offered. So they actually tested this out, and you can go on YouTube if you want and watch videos of bumblebees playing with balls, just because they discovered that, yeah, when they set up experiments and that bees would go into rooms that had no nectar rewards, just little balls that they could roll around and have fun with. And the other thing they noticed was it tended to be the youngest bees that did it. So just like the rest of the animal world, it tends to be the kids that play with the different stuff that's lying around. However, having said that bumblebees are really smart, they're not quite as smart as some of the plants out there. So there is a plant in Europe called the laughing bumblebee orchid. And this flower has managed to, evolve to look like a female bumblebee and to smell like a female bumblebee. And so it attracts male bumblebees who come in thinking this is their lucky day, and they will land on this flower thinking that something else is happening, when in actual fact, all they're doing is collecting lots of pollen or giving back pollen from a flower that they've visited before, because the male bumblebees have a really low learning curve. If it looks like a female, they are going to land on that flower over and over again. So I've mentioned that bumblebees evolved, we think, in the Himalayas, because that's where the greatest diversity is. In North America, we have not quite 50 species, and most of that diversity is across the north of the country, which is unusual, because for other bees, if you've ever learnt about native bees in North America, most bumblebees are actually found in the dry southwest. But because they're adapted to cold, you're going to find most bumblebees in North America in the northwest areas. But within Maryland and sort of Virginia area, we have about 15 species. Now, unfortunately, bumblebee species are not doing very well. Of the 15 species that were previously recorded in our area, we think at least 4 of them have now been lost completely. But another 6 are very rare, and only 5 bumblebees really are seen on a common basis. And of them, 3 are by far the most likely ones that you're going to see in your yard. So I'm going to give you a really fast introduction to identifying really these most common of bumblebees, so you can have a chance to go outside and have a look. And the best thing is right at the moment is the best time to identify bumblebees. So I'm going to just, refresh your memory, I'm sure, on insect biology that they have the three body parts: the head, thorax, and the abdomen. And on a bumblebee, the abdomen is made up of what's called tergal segments, or just sections. And so when they are kind of curved, as they often are, you can actually see these different sections. And most of bumblebee identification revolves around the colors of these different segments, whether they're black or yellow, or sometimes a different color, and occasionally the colors of these thoraxes. Okay. Now, I'm going to make bumblebee identification seem really easy today. It's actually not as easy as I'm going to talk about. But right now, it's easier because the only bumblebees that you're going to see are queen bumblebees. So that reduces the amount of variation in colors that you can see. But even for one of the bumblebees we're going to look at, the two-spotted bumblebee, you can see this guide that's available free online. You can download as a PDF, that there's is some variation even in the queen color patterns. And if you look down at the males, there's a huge amount of color variation. So bumblebee identification actually gets hardest once those males emerge later in the year. And I just wanted to, acknowledge that a lot of my pictures of bumblebees have come from the USGS Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab, which is actually at the Patuxent Research Refuge, where they collect bumblebees and do surveys to, establish what population levels are like. So when they collect their bees, they come in looking a little bit like this. They could have been collected in bowls, which means they get wet and goopy. And so when they take their pictures, they do actually blow their hair dry and flick their hair up and print them up so that they are photo ready. So that's the pictures that we'll be seeing as we're looking at these IDs. So by far the most common bumblebee to see anywhere along the East Coast is the common eastern bumblebee. For once, a bee has its really appropriate name. So Bombus impatiens. And this bee is mostly yellow, although it can often have a dark spot in the center of its thorax. And then that first section that's closest to the thorax will be yellow. Okay, you can see there's just a slight bit of a wiggle in the way that first section goes, and you can see that here. Now, one of the other great things about recognizing bumblebees that's really an important part of getting the feel of what a bumblebee looks like is to look at the length of their hair. And to help you remember hair length, I'm going to describe a little process that these bumblebees have gone through. So the bumblebee looks a bit like it's had a buzz cut, yeah? So this bumblebee looks like maybe it joined the Marines a couple of weeks ago, and the buzz cut is just starting to grow out. So it's neat, but longish, okay? So that is our Bombus impatiens. And we can look again here, nice flat top to this bumblebee. But very neat looking hair, and you can just see that first section is yellow. So you can see from that how the curve, you can see all these different sections on their abdomen and the different colors of them. Okay, the second most common bumblebee that you might find in our area is Bombus bimaculatus, which means two-spotted, which is not always the best name because, to be honest, the spots are smushed together, so they often look a lot more like a W than they do look like two spots. But continuing in the hair analogy, this bee looks like the bee that's going to go join the Marines and still has longer hair. So it's really noticeable when you see these bees that their hair looks much shaggier than the Bombus impatiens. So getting used to looking at hair length is a big help for these IDs. So we could see here the two spots, they kind of look, like I said, like they're joined together. So really a bit more of a W than two distinct spots. But even from these side views, you can often see those little spots poking out. So look, we've got that first section still all yellow, second section got a little bit of yellow in the middle, but not on the sides. So here's a really good example of, oh, it's a boy bumblebee because it's got hairy legs, longish bed hair, and there's a lot more yellow on this bee than would be on the female. So you can just see at the front of this bee that it's got yellow on the face, actually has a yellow beard. Now, finally, the third of these most common bees is the Bombus cruciacolis, or the brown-belted bumblebee. So this one, I'm not quite so keen on the name, because for me, this bee does not have a belt. It has a fanny pack. As you can see, the shape is sort of a half moon in this second section. So usually you're not going to see a full belt of brown, just the fanny pack. So this bumblebee is the neatest of all of them in its hair, and this is the day they joined the Marines and got that buzz cut, because it's a perfectly groomed flat buzz cut on this bee. So when we're looking at the bees in reality here, you can see this kind of, it can be quite brown to just off yellow, really. The sort of half moon on the back of this bee, and again from the side here you can still see that half moon shape to the bee. Okay, and this one again is a male, so we're seeing some yellow on the face and slightly longer hair because it's a male, but still really well trimmed. Okay, and even though I wanted to keep bumblebee identification really easily by just running through those three main bees, I couldn't resist showing you my favorite bumblebees in Maryland, which are the Bombus oricomis and Bombus pennsylvanicus, which are hard to tell apart, but they're the black and gold, or the American bumblebee. So actually, I hadn't realized before I started learning about bees that pennsylvanicus was actually American. So now I know that Maryland maybe isn't in that America. So these bumblebees are exactly like those ones I first looked at when I said, if you drew a bee, this is how you would draw it. Because these ones have bold stripes of yellow, black, yellow, black. So they just look like exactly like the bees that you should, be seeing in a cartoon. And so I was really excited when one day, after planting an awful lot of native plants in my yard, I was excited to find one of these bumblebees. Of course, I didn't have my good camera, so I just had to snap it on my phone, but proof that these, beautiful, huge, chunky, stripy bees are in my yard too. So there are a few bees out there that look kind of like a bumblebee, but aren't a bumblebee. So sometimes people get confused by this one, the well-known carpenter bee, the bee that gives other bees often a bad name because it's the one that will chew holes into soft wood. That's a whole nother talk, but if you paint wood, it can really help distract them from going into wood. And you can also do what I tried doing, which is put up decoy wood, soft wood they don't care if they chew into, so they stay away from my screened-in porch. But the difference between these bees is they don't live in a hive like the bumblebees do, and they don't collect pollen and mix it with nectar to carry it wet. They carry it dry. So they actually have very hairy legs. These are the hairs on their legs and the hairs over here. So they're carrying pollen dry. But the thing that really gives it away is they actually don't have hairs on the lower part of their abdomen. So you can remember they're the ones with the shiny high knees. So that will always tell you it's a carpenter bee. Funnily enough, not just bees try to look like bumblebees. There's a whole load of other animals that are out there trying to fake you out. And these are mostly flies who are the wannabes, because by looking like a bee, you might be like, oh, it might sting me. I don't want to touch it. And they're also kind of fat and chunky. So imitating a bumblebee makes sense for them. So in your yard, you might see this, the narcissus fly that goes after your daffodils bulbs, if you have any of those. There is the Volucella, and if you look at this fly and think that looks like a bumblebee, you're not the only ones, because this bee is such a good mimic. It'll actually crawl into the hives of bumblebees. The bumblebees don't realize it's not a bumblebee, and it actually lays its eggs in the nest, and its young, the larvae, will just eat all the detritus, the sort of falling down bits of wax and everything at the bottom of the nest. Then there's things like the bee fly that actually parasitizes other types of solitary bees. And this, the amazing robber fly that is a super fast fly. And this one is looking like a bumblebee, so it can hang out where bumblebees are without being recognized by a bumblebee, because this one will catch and eat bumblebees. So this is a predator of the bumblebees. But the scariest thing out there for every bumblebee is actually this, the conopid or thick-headed fly. And this really is your nightmare if you are a bumblebee, because this fly will fly through the air. It's so agile. If you look at it, this one is pretending to be a wasp, but it is a fly. It's going to grab the bumblebee, and then those tergal segments on the abdomen that I talked about, it's going to separate them with its very pointy abdomen and lay its eggs inside of the bumblebee. And then it's like the day of the body snatchers, because this larvae is going to grow inside the bumblebee and eat it. And eventually it releases chemicals that take over the bumblebee's brain, turn the bumblebee into kind of a zombie, and makes the bumblebee land on the ground, dig a hole and bury itself in its own grave under the ground, so that the flies can safely develop under the ground and emerge next year. So I have to admit, I was a little distraught when I found this fly in my yard. But I have to remind myself, this is the circle of life, and everything in life, there's checks and balances. So bumblebees have adapted to deal with these kind of predators, but what they haven't been able to adapt to, unfortunately, is the rapid pace that humans, us, are changing the world. And so many of our bumblebees are in danger. We have at least a third of them in the United States and considered threatened or greatly endangered. And these threats are all the normal threats that face our world. So, of course, we have habitat loss, because we've turned fields that used to look like this into fields that, just have no flowers in whatsoever, or we've turned them into housing developments. But as I'm going to talk about later, we can return these back into bumblebee habitat. By bringing bees into greenhouses and raising them in boxes in huge numbers, we've actually managed to make disease be spread. It's like we haven't learned anything from things like coronavirus, that we need to spread out and not all pack things close together, because that's how disease is spread. And these bees, unfortunately, are then able to escape from the greenhouses, and they've spread disease into the population. And there's been a massive decline in bumblebee wild populations, including the loss of the rusty patch bumblebee from Maryland, since these diseases have spread from greenhouses. We also are putting them under pressure by putting huge numbers of honeybees into wild areas for them to feed. And remember, there's 60,000 bees in each one of these hives. And some studies have shown that every one of these hives means there's 30,000 less wild bees in the areas where the wild honeybees are living. We spread tons of pesticides and herbicides into the world. This is a quick demonstration of how much one of the neonicotinoid pesticides have increased in usage. And this, 1994, there were still lots of bumblebees around. And during the time that the increase in use of these pesticides have gone up, this is the same time that all our bumblebee populations have decreased. And then, of course, we're talking about a bumblebee that's adapted to the cold. So as the climate gets too warm, it just gets the bumblebees, overheat and can't survive. And what we've been finding is that bumblebee ranges are disappearing from the south. So their southern range is disappearing. But they're not very good at spreading north, because when they emerge, they immediately look for a nesting area right there. So they're only traveling north at a much slower rate. So there's actually this squeeze going on as the range of bumblebees starts to decline. But the wonderful thing about bumblebees is they are really small. Like, if you wanted to preserve those polar bears or say bison, you need a place the size of Yellowstone to keep buffaloes in. But a bumblebee hive can be entirely in your yard. You only need to support 50 bees. And so your yard can actually be that Yellowstone for bumblebees. And to do it, it's really easy. All we need to do is stop using all those chemicals, and we need to plant lots and lots of flowering plants. And the best ones are going to be native because those are the ones they're adapted to. To support bumblebees, we want to have flowers through the seasons, and then don't be too tidy because they are looking for those like slightly, overgrown areas, bottoms of grasses, or nests that they can make their nests in. So I have lots of pictures of flowers, and you're going to go, oh my gosh, she's going through so fast. But at the end of all these flowers, I have a little guide that you can click on and get the information of all these plants that I'm going to mention. So to support them in the springtime, really the best things are like spring flowering trees and shrubs. So everything from the willows and redbuds and cherries to basswoods, and then lots of shrubs. So, dogwoods and choke cherries, New Jersey tea, lots of things that just make your yard beautiful anyway. In this first bit of spring, the spring ephemeral flowers, so wild geraniums, the bluebells I showed you earlier, and even some weeds like the dead purple nettle up here, bumblebees will go to, and even the dreaded creeping Charlie that I like is such an awful plant to get in your yard, does feed bumblebees. As spring advances, they love those wild blue indigos at the pea family. They can push apart. They love these bell-shaped flowers, like the foxglove beard tongue here, and they like open flowers, so things like sundrops. As summer starts to arrive, they love things like blazing stars. They love all the different milkweed flowers that will obviously also help monarch butterflies, from the butterfly weed to swamp milkweed. And they love all the cone flowers, so any kind of like purple cone flower. And then the echinaceas and rudbeckias they really enjoy. As summer advances, they love things like anise hyssop. All the bee balms will be smothered with bumblebees. That's always a place I go to look for them. Really cool, funky flowers like the turtle head. They're able to, this is one of the ones where they have to open up, use their front and back legs to open up this flower. And of course, mountain mints, the pycnanthemum, always going to be covered with lots of bees. Then later on in summer, there are still more flowers. So if you haven't seen obedient plant, that has this open bell shape that bumblebees love to crawl into. Things like the cardinal lobelia, great blue lobelia, or the red lobelia. And if you haven't got much space at all, think about just growing small sunflowers in pots, because sunflowers are just like, crack cocaine for bumblebees. They will be all over them. Just make sure you buy sunflowers that have pollen. Sometimes they sell ones that are for cut flowers to bring indoors, and then they have no pollen or nectar, so that they won't feed any bees. And then finally, in the fall, when those new queens are coming out and needing to fatten up, that's when you should have some of the huge array of native asters and goldenrods that will help feed both them and our migrating monarchs going off to Mexico. So those plants really are a 2-for-1 in what they will feed. So I know that was a crazy fast visit through native plants, but I really wanted to make this talk focused on the bumblebees themselves. But that's how we can help them. So I did promise that I would give you the resources to all those plants. So I have a Wakelet page, which is just like a link online where you could find all the resources. I've put in a PDF with a list of all those flowers that I just went back through. And of course, I think this video does get posted online, so you can always slow it down and pause. But you can take a picture of this QR code as well if you want, and that will take you straight to that resource page of all the different information about bumblebees. So if you've getting as excited by bumblebees as I do, then there's also lots of citizen science that we can do with bumblebees, because they're the bees that are really big enough to be able to learn how to identify them. They're actually also a very, very placid bee. When they're collecting pollen, they really are focused on collecting pollen, and they are not aggressive at all. Even if you disturb their nests, which are very hard to find, they will not aggressively defend their nests like honeybees will. So it's very rare for anyone to get stung by bumblebees. In fact, one of the few people I know that got stung by a bumblebee was my daughter when she was 2. She saw a bumblebee and she looked so fuzzy. She wanted to stroke it to see how it felt. And if you know a 2-year-old, being stroked by a 2-year-old is not a soft experience. She kind of squeeze that bumblebee, and that's what it takes to make a bumblebee sting you, is to squeeze it. But as I said, we're not allergic. But the one time that some allergies have been found with bumblebees is those workers that work in greenhouses that are like collecting tomatoes, and they're like disturbing bees, the bumblebees in the greenhouse all the time, and they get stung multiple times. And some of those people have developed allergies, but those are the only known ones. So it's a great thing to like do things like join these citizen science projects that allows us to monitor how bumblebees are doing, because they're one of the few bees, like I said, that we can easily observe, and it helps give us an idea of like how all the other bee species that are too small to usually recognize in the field are doing. So these are great programs. Okay, so I hope you felt what felt to me like a huge rush through the wonderful world of bumblebees. But I'm going to stop sharing now to see if we have any questions.
We do. I will pull some questions from our chat here. Thank you so much, Claire, for all of that great information. Someone is wondering about how much pollen or nectar can a single bumblebee collect?
So I was like looking that up the other day. So I'm trying to remember. It takes for them to fill that honey pot, it takes about 70 trips to get a teaspoon of nectar. So, but I couldn't find out how many trips it was to actually collect all the pollen they at the same time. But I do know that queen bumblebee, to raise her first family, she has to visit about 6,000 flowers. So when I tell people that, they kind of go, oh, because I don't have 6,000 flowers in my yard. But if you have a red bud, you probably do, because red buds are just covered with thousands of flowers. And that's why it is really important in that early springtime to think about flowering trees and shrubs if you're going to be able to feed a hungry queen bumblebee.
Thank you, Claire. Someone is wondering, they say it seems counterintuitive for flowers to evolve to hide their stamen. Wouldn't that put the plant at risk to not reproduce? Why would a plant evolve to hide their stamen?
Okay, so the reason is if you like just have everything out there, so any bee that comes to you is going to collect nectar and pollen, then that bee then might go to a different flower and your pollen goes off and gets wasted. But you can bribe a bee to come to you and only flowers like you by giving them an extra big reward. But if you did that to everybody, you'd run out of all your pollen and nectar. So what they've done is they've bet on the fact that if they give a big enough reward to a bumblebee, that those bumblebees will hunt out every single tomato plant in the garden and reliably pollinate them all. And your pollen doesn't get wasted by going off to some, like random mint or something like that. So that's what they're doing. And it's a successful family. The Solanaceae is a really big flower family. So, as a strategy, it does work for them. But there are some flowers that need those really long-tongued bees to get to their pollen, and long-tongued bees are specialists on those flowers, and those are the ones that are declining in population the most. So there is this risk that we can lose the bee and you lose the flower because they are so intricately connected.
Thank you, Claire. Someone is wondering, Does the queen bumblebee make the honey pot herself?
Yes, she does. Yep. So bumblebees, like honeybees, and kind of people that I know as well, are able to make wax. So their wax, rather than coming out of ears, which of course they don't have, comes out from kind of under their armpits. So they are able to exude the wax, and they use that to make their little honey pot, and they fill it with nectar just for them. But yes, it's one of those kind of strange facts about bees that they can make wax.
Excellent. Someone's wondering, if there is no honey, do only the queens in the spring go for nectar, and do foragers drink nectar at all for themselves?
Yes, yes. So she's to get enough energy to fly. A lot of that nectar is really just for her energy to fly around. So, and raising that body temperature, like I talked about, because they can go from 30 degrees to 86 Fahrenheit in 15 minutes. They're burning so much energy when they do that. It would be like us eating a Mars bar every 30 seconds. That's how much energy they're having to consume. So actually, most of that nectar is like for their personal benefit when they're out foraging for the nectar, but they do mix the pollen with it to make that solid bee bread. So the babies are getting a mixture of pollen that has proteins and then the nectar that has energy. So it's like a complete food for the babies.
Great, thank you. Someone is wondering, can bumblebees pollinate, I think it's Ganation flowers?
Oh, you're gonna catch me out here. If it's not a native flower, I will. No. So they are generalists, and they will go to lots of flowers. So it tends to be they will go to a flower if it's got high levels of nectar. If it's like a flower that doesn't have a nectar or really large amounts of flat pollen, that's when they ignore it. And often then it's smaller bees that pollinate those flowers that just aren't as generous. Bumblebees tend to focus on bigger patches of more obvious flowers. They're not going to waste their time with one little flower over here. That's the job of the little bees, who will go to all the flowers where there's no competition. Because if you watch a big patch of flowers, those bumblebees are pretty pushy. They get in there and they're get out of the way, and they're pushing all the little bees out because we're the big guys, we take over this patch. And so those big patches, they're dominated by the big bees, and smaller, smaller and isolated flowers, that's where the little bees get their share of stuff.
That is great to know. Someone is wondering if bumblebees ever swarm.
No, they don't swarm because they don't start new nests. I didn't have time to go into a really interesting thing that there are parasitic bumblebees. So these are bumblebees that don't raise their own hives. They sneak into somebody else's hive. In Maryland, it's mostly those common eastern bumblebees, and they actually will fight and kill the queen, and then they take over the nest, and they have those workers raise their babies. But there's no swarming because there's no going to start a new hive anywhere. So, I could see in the chat, someone says bee balm is red. Yeah, it's wild bergamot in that Monarda family. But weirdly enough, that favorite bee of mine, the big stripy American bee, I always see that at the red bee balm. And traditionally, bees can't see the color red and don't go to red flowers. But that one I guess it's got so much nectar because it attracts hummingbirds, and hummingbirds need a ton of nectar. So those bees have obviously figured out, as the biggest bees out there, that they need to go to flowers that have the most nectar, and that's going to be those red bee balms, the Monarda didyma. Oh, gentian flowers. Yeah, I think they do go to those. Yeah, sorry.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to have us answer one more question here. Someone is wondering if bumblebees can hybridize.
So that's an interesting question. I've not heard that. Well, so not that I know of in North America. Now, there are subspecies. So I don't know. Did you tell that I was English? So England has their own like subspecies of what's called the buff-tailed bumblebee. So it's the one with the white tails, and you'll see pictures of those all the time. And we have our own subspecies in England. The European one is a different subspecies, but they've brought that in for those greenhouses, and now they've escaped from greenhouses and they're like are breeding with the local ones and stuff. So, but I don't think across species there's hybridization. I haven't heard of that.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for this absolutely fascinating lecture. And thank you so much, everyone who joined us today.